Hey everyone, it's your guy here, and today we are going to unpack this whole Russia-Ukraine mess, not as some distant foreign news, but as a slow-motion disaster that affects every single one of us, including here in the United States. So sit tight because I'm going to lay it all out. Every piece, no shortcuts. And I'm going to dig deep into what this really means for the global balance of power and for us as Americans watching from across the ocean. Let's start with the numbers. The Soviet Union's Great Patriotic War, their fight for survival against the Nazis, lasted 1,418 days. That's brutal. That's a generation of suffering, sacrifice, and blood. Now look at this. Russia's so-called special military operation against Ukraine has now dragged on for more than 1,590 days. Let that sink in. It's already outlasted the entire Soviet struggle against Hitler. Think about that for a second. The Red Army, with all its manpower and industrial might, took 1,418 days to push from Moscow all the way to Berlin. And now, the modern Russian military, which we were told was the second best in the world, can't even secure a victory in its own backyard after more than 4 years. Sunday Zoo wrote centuries ago, and I quote, "In war, haste is better than cleverness. Prolonged operations are rarely wise." He also said, and this is crucial, there has never been a case where a prolonged war benefited a state. Why? Because war is the most expensive bet between nations. It's not just about bullets and bodies, it's about money, morale, manufacturing, and the will to keep going. The longer it drags, the more your resources dry up, your society fractures, your people lose faith in their leadership, and in the end, you're just eating your own foundation. So the rule is simple. Attack like lightning, defend like a rock, but never ever get stuck in a long slog. That's military 101. And somehow the Russians forgot that lesson, yet here we are. And Russia is clearly bogged down in Ukraine's quagmire. They're bleeding out, can't break free, can't reset the board, can't find an exit ramp on June 28th. President Putin stood in front of his United Russia Party Congress and flat out admitted that the country is at a fate-determining moment. Those are his words, not mine. He claimed the West can't defeat Russia on the battlefield, so they're trying to collapse it from the inside. That's classic Putin. Always blaming external forces for internal failures. But flashback 4 years ago, everyone, including a lot of so-called military analysts in our own country, thought Russian armor would roll into Kyiv in 1 hour and 22 minutes. Remember that. 1 hour, 22 minutes was the meme, the prediction, the expectation. That unstoppable force aura, that vitality and momentum was real. People actually believed Russia would just cruise through Ukraine like it was nothing. Now, it's fate determining 4 years, and look at the reversal. Honestly, it's staggering, and frankly, it should be a wake-up call for anyone who thinks military power alone guarantees success. So the big question is, where does this go from here? Does Russia bite the bullet, declare full national mobilization, throw every available asset at Ukraine, and maybe even challenge the EU directly? Or do they just keep bleeding out until the country collapses from the inside? The hard truth is that time is not on Moscow's side. When a conventional war drags this long, internal and external pressures pile up like an avalanche, and nobody can guarantee that the wheel of history won't spin back to 1917. The year Lenin boarded that sealed train to Petrograd and changed everything. That's the danger for any autocratic regime. When the war goes bad, the people start asking questions. And the answers are never pretty. Let's look at the battlefield first, because that's where the public focus usually is. On the map, Russia still holds most of the Donbas. The land corridor to Crimea and the peninsula itself, they're still pushing forward a few hundred yards every day, grinding through Ukrainian defenses with sheer weight of numbers. But outside those trench lines, the strategic environment is hitting a breaking point. Before this war, Russia was seen internationally, yes, even in our own intelligence briefings, as almost a peer competitor to the United States, the undisputed #2 military power on Earth. They had modernized their forces, built up their missile arsenals, and projected power from Syria to the Arctic. Now, a permanent member of the UN Security Council launched a full-scale invasion of its own neighbor, rolled tanks across open plains in Europe, and 4 years later, they still haven't sealed the deal. Instead, they're buried under an avalanche of global sanctions. The most severe ever imposed on a major economy. Their overseas state assets are frozen. Their Black Sea fleet is a ghost fleet. Their armored vehicle losses have exceeded 10,000, and even their strategic bombers, nuclear-capable platforms that are supposed to be untouchable, have taken hits on their own airfields. The embarrassment is beyond words. This is not the Russia we grew up watching on the world stage, and the dominoes, they're falling one after another, faster than anyone predicted. Syria, which Moscow spent years propping up with air power, mercenaries, and diplomatic cover, flipped overnight. Assad's grip crumbled the moment Russian attention shifted to Ukraine. In Venezuela, Maduro got taken down so that South American foothold, that little base they had in our own hemisphere, is gone. Finland and Sweden, historically neutral for decades, sometimes even leaning pro-Russian, sprinted into NATO, doubling the alliance's border with Russia overnight. That's not a small thing. That's a strategic nightmare for Moscow. In the Caucasus and Central Asia, former Soviet republics are accelerating their de-Russianization, kicking out Russian military bases, switching trade routes, and looking to China and Turkey instead. Even Armenia and Azerbaijan, bitter enemies for decades over Nagorno-Karabakh, have found relative peace, partly because Russia is too weak to stir up trouble anymore. Russia's geopolitical buffer zone is shrinking from a global power's backyard to a regional player's porch. And against all this, Moscow has practically no effective countermeasures. They're watching their empire erode in real time, and they can't do a damn thing about it. Now let's talk about the home front, because that's where the real rot is, and that's where this war will ultimately be decided. The economy is in free fall. Inflation keeps hitting new highs. The central bank has kept its benchmark interest rate at around 20% for what feels like forever. And that's a rate that would crush any normal economy. At least 30% of federal revenue is being swallowed by the war in eastern Ukraine, sucking money away from education, healthcare, infrastructure, and everything else that keeps a society running. They still haven't transitioned out of a wartime economy, and even their single aircraft carrier, their pride and joy, the Admiral Kuznetsov, is barely kept afloat, leaking money and suffering breakdown after breakdown. But here's the killer. Ukraine's drone production has ramped up like crazy, and they've gotten bold. They're going straight for Russia's economic jugular, the oil refineries. Russia has plenty of crude oil. We all know that. But most of it needs to be processed into usable fuel, gasoline, diesel. Jet fuel for a country that depends on energy exports for the vast majority of its foreign revenue. Refineries are literally the throat of the economy. And now Ukraine is churning out millions of cheap drones per year, some costing as little as a few $100s each. So which refinery is most valuable? That's the one they hit. As of June this year, 16 major refineries inside Russia have been struck, over 40 core refining units have been forced offline, and roughly 40% of the country's refining capacity is effectively paralyzed. That's not a nuisance. That's a body blow. Take the Kropotny refinery right outside Moscow. It supplies 35 to 40% of the capital's gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel for the whole metropolitan area. On June 18th alone, over 200 drones swarmed it in a saturation attack. 200 at once. Official estimates say it'll be out of action for at least 6 months. That means Moscow just lost nearly 40% of its local fuel supply overnight. And what do you see? Civilians lining up for hours day and night just to fill their tanks. The people of Moscow are finally tasting real shortages. The kind they never thought would reach their streets, the kind that make people angry, and angry people in an autocracy start asking uncomfortable questions. And here's the truly ugly part. Most of these refineries rely on Western components, turbines, control systems, catalysts, specialized software that have been under sanctions since 2022 and are completely cut off. So Russia sits on mountains of crude, but if the refineries are wrecked, they can't turn that crude into gasoline or diesel. It's not just a security problem anymore. Ukraine's strikes have turned Russia, the oil superpower, into a country facing its own energy crisis, and that's a direct knife into the government's wallet. And it doesn't stop at refineries. Since the start of this year, Ukrainian drones have also taken out a huge number of military logistics hubs, ammunition depots, and transport infrastructure inside Russian territory. We're talking about railways, supply convoys, command centers, the kind of targets that don't make big headlines but slowly choke an army to death. Let's be honest, any major power, whether it's Russia or the United States, simply cannot afford to have its rear areas pounded nonstop for years in a drawn-out conventional war. The more strikes you absorb at home, the more your frontline troops starve for supplies, and the more passive your entire campaign becomes. And here's something that hits close to home for us as Americans. We learned this lesson the hard way in Vietnam. You can't win a war if your supply lines are constantly under threat and your home front is bleeding. The Russians are learning that same lesson right now. In real time, what makes this so dangerous for Russia is that Ukraine now has two near unassailable advantages that they didn't have at the start. First, the drone Starlink AI combo. Drones are cheap, precise, have extended range through satellite guidance, and carry terminal phase anti-jamming capabilities. That means you either waste expensive interceptor missiles, some costing millions each, to shoot them down, or you let them hit high-value targets. Either way, you lose. They're not trading soldiers on the front. They're trading infrastructure, refineries, arms factories, power stations, and that's a fight Russia cannot win economically. Second, Ukraine is no longer functioning as a normal state. It's essentially a European-backed war machine. Most of its military production is based inside the European Union. Its civilian supplies come from the EU, and Western military tech companies are providing direct technical support on the ground. So when Russia wants to retaliate, what can they hit? Ukraine's high-value economic and military targets have already been bombed flat multiple times over. There's practically nothing left worth destroying. That's the cruel irony. Ukraine has outsourced its critical infrastructure to Europe, making it immune to Russian strikes. That's the cruel math. Russia can't really cut off Ukraine's external lifeline, because that lifeline runs through EU territory, through Poland, Romania, Slovakia. They can launch barrages all week, but Ukraine still gets shells, missiles, and energy from Europe. Russia's own valuable assets are all sitting inside its own borders, fully exposed to Ukrainian strikes. 2 years ago, Ukraine didn't have the drone numbers or the range. Now they do, and they can even mount saturation attacks on Russian soil. So let's summarize. Russian strikes on Ukraine are strategically limited. Ukrainian strikes on Russia's refineries and factories are genuinely existential. That's the asymmetry that's killing Moscow. Because at the end of the day, war is about economics. Always has been, always will be for a weaker state facing a stronger one. The strategic goal is simple. Play the barefoot gambler. Make it a lose-lose proposition. Bleed the stronger side so badly that they quit out of exhaustion. The Vietnam War, the Soviet-Afghan War. Same pattern, same outcome. The stronger power always runs out of patience first. Ukraine is the barefoot one relative to Russia. But Russia is the barefoot one relative to the European Union. So if Russia wants to win, they have to take out the EU-based factories that are feeding Ukraine. Not just lob a few missiles and call it a day. If they keep going with this half-hearted symbolic bombing campaign, they genuinely risk losing this war. Just look at Iran as a case study. Under the old supreme leader, they hesitated, got pushed around by the US and Israel, took hits without real retaliation. Then the new leadership came in and said, enough. They went all in, targeted us command centers, bases, radar sites, even fighter jets, no fear, no filter. They played the all or nothing card. And what happened? That one punch opens the door approach actually worked. The soft underbelly of capitalist resolve showed up. And Trump ended up signing a withdrawal deal in Versailles. That's the power of total commitment. Now, Putin today reminds me of the old Iranian leadership, trying to maintain great power dignity, playing chess, balancing China against the West. Hoping a US-China confrontation will let him scoop up the spoils. He's been playing that game for years, thinking he can outmaneuver everyone. On top of that, Russia's elite class has never truly let go of Europe. They still dream of reintegration, of being welcomed back into the European family. They vacation in the French Riviera, their kids study in London, their money sits in Swiss banks, so they refuse to burn those bridges completely. Those two illusions have tied Putin's hands. He won't strike European facilities that are directly arming Ukraine, even though those are the real supply lines. He's hoping Europe will blink first, but they haven't, and they won't as long as they don't feel personally threatened. But while you're begging to return to Europe, they're not returning the favor. And inside Russia, the pressure is building faster than anyone admits. If Putin keeps hesitating, the young hardliners and nationalist factions will only get louder. Plenty of people in Moscow and St. Petersburg are already whispering for a younger, more reckless leader, someone like Putin himself back in the Second Chechen War, when he was the tough, decisive, no-nonsense guy who got things done, the longer this drags. The higher the chance that some internal coup or palace revolt becomes real. Just recently, a video from a retired officer named Lunin went viral across Russian social media. and it already showed that the population's tolerance is nearing its breaking point. People are scared, and scared people in Russia turn on their leaders. That's the history of that country. When things go bad, the regime doesn't survive. And this is where history gives us chills. Think back to World War I. The Russian Empire declared war on Germany, and Austria-Hungary took catastrophic casualties, sent soldiers to the front without rifles, left civilians starving in Petrograd. Bread shops ran dry, people stood in lines for hours. Then came 1917. First the February Revolution, then October, and the Tsar and his entire family were executed. Right now, the parallels are uncomfortably strong. No authoritarian state can afford to lose a foreign war. And in Russian history, czars who lose wars do not survive politically. Total casualties on both sides have already passed 1,800,000, making this the deadliest conventional conflict since World War II. At that scale, nobody can just walk away. How do you withdraw from a war with hundreds of thousands of dead the day Putin orders a full retreat? He's politically finished, Nicholas II all over again, and Zelensky is in the same trap. If he concedes, the interests behind him are dead meat too. Neither man can afford peace, because peace would mean surrender, and surrender would mean their heads on a platter. So both sides are bleeding, both are exhausted, and it's purely a contest of who collapses first. Can they negotiate? Absolutely not. The gaps are too wide. Ukraine demands Russia withdraw from Donbas and Crimea. Russia will never agree. Russia demands Ukraine disarm and formally recognize those regions as Russian. Ukraine will never agree, so there's no off-ramp. Russia's only real path to victory, if there is one, is to go full Iranian mode, start hitting NATO assets, mobilize the entire country, and signal that they're ready to drag the whole European continent into the fire. They need to make Paris, Berlin, and London feel that they're also in the crosshairs. Only then might the EU think twice about unlimited aid to Ukraine. Because let's be real, the European Union does not have the stomach for World War III over one country. They like the idea of being a global power, but when the bombs start falling on their own cities, that calculation changes fast. They're not warriors, they're traitors. And traitors don't fight to the death, but if Russia just keeps bleeding for another 10 years, Putin at 80, a shattered demographic base, an economy twisted beyond recognition, how long can that last? They'll get ground down by Ukraine's attrition warfare. Yeah. Russia has a reputation for grinding out tough wars, but Ukraine's independent spirit, from Kievan Rus to the Cossack host, is just as stubborn. Fortunes shift, and right now the ice is melting under Moscow's feet. They really are at that fate-determining point, win ugly or collapse spectacularly. Putin himself once said that Russia must either be strong or cease to exist. Now he has to live by those words, and from where I'm sitting, the clock is ticking. Now, let me be clear as an American commentator. I'm not here to cheer for either side. That's not our job, but from our strategic perspective, we watch every move, because any major shift in Eurasia affects our interests, our alliances, and our security posture. A weakened Russia might seem like a good thing, but a collapsing Russia is a dangerous thing. Nuclear weapons, instability, refugees, you name it. So we have to pay attention. That said, I'll also note that from Beijing's angle, and I say this only as context because it affects the global balance that we care about. They have their own balancing act. Both Russia and Ukraine came from the Soviet legacy. So in theory, it's brothers fighting brothers, but in practice, Russia has blocked China in the Northeast and Central Asia over the years, while Ukraine has done things like visit the Yasukuni Shrine, push for Western sanctions on China, seize over $4 billion of Chinese assets in the Motorsic case. That's over $4 billion US dollars, by the way, help Japan build drone units and even support Hong Kong separatists. So China doesn't lean either way. They just give a little extra support to whoever seems weaker at any given moment to keep a sense of balance. But that's their game, not ours from our American standpoint. We observe. We analyze and we call it like we see it, without illusions, without blinders. War is hell and peace would be wonderful, but reality doesn't bend to wishes. We've been down this road before in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and we know that wars don't end when the shooting stops. They end when the politics align, and right now the politics are a mess. That's the full picture today. No sugarcoating, no shortcuts, no missing pieces. I've laid out the battlefield, the economy, the drones, the refineries, the historical parallels, and the strategic dead ends. I've told you what Russia should do if they want to win, why they won't do it, and what happens if they don't. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I'll catch you in the next one. Stay sharp, stay honest, and never let anyone tell you that long wars have easy endings. This one is far from over, and the next chapter is going to be even uglier. I'll see you soon.